Hello, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians that we're all on in the lands where we're zooming in tonight. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in on the call tonight. Very exciting this last few days to get the wording for the voice referendum. There's no secret I'm out with a yes vote. Looking forward to engaging other people in the electorate and beyond in good civics to get people engaged and informed and hopefully getting in my opinion, a positive outcome in the upcoming referendum. Tim Buckley, Climate, Energy, Finance, waiting there. Where are you coming to us from?
From Sydney CBD.
Yeah, okay. Is that a UTS building?
Hilton Hotel.
Oh, okay, great. Tim will be taking, I was going to do this myself, but you know what? When you've got someone in our electorate like Tim, you just have to use him, right? And he's been busy doing interviews today on this very topic. It's a perfect day and evening to talk about the safeguard mechanism. So what I was going to do is firstly just to thank you all for coming. A few people have sent in questions already by email. Fantastic, ready to go with those. So tonight, just assuming that people are interested, some have very high levels of knowledge about what this is all about, others do not. So I thought we'd just do a quick one-on-one on what is the safeguard mechanism, why it's important, how it's been going so far, what happened today, which helped create, frankly, possibly some important climate policy history in Australia's very shaky and extremely tardy history. What is still to be done, what's going to happen next. And really also, I think people want to know where is the Liberal National Party, particularly our local member, on the issue around the safeguards mechanism. So I'll weigh in without any bars hold on that one. So just straight up, safeguards mechanism is possibly, and Tim will actually correct me when I'm going off piste, one of the only sticks we have in the suite of things that the government at a federal level has attempted to put in place around actually curbing greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. It is a bit of legislation that was brought in under Tony Abbott, I think. I think Nick Xenophon had a little bit of help trying to put into place some teeth that actually created the mechanism to actually reduce emissions. Today, it covers around 28% of industrial emissions, just over 150 companies that run 250 of these big facilities that produce a lot of climate pollution. At the Smart Energy Council, where I'm advising, we like to call it the big polluters, I suppose, law. And really, the way I see it is there's two groups of facilities that are covered by this legislation. There are those that like cement, steel, aluminium, some of the chemicals industries that with technology and different systems of production can find a way to our net zero ambitions by 2050 or hopefully by 2040. And then there are those facilities that no matter what they do, frankly, are not going to get there. They just need to probably stop operating or phase out. They are things like coal and gas. So you can see why it's a very difficult and fraught thing to discuss. Broadly speaking, people who run those facilities have to, well, intentionally go to market to, well, first, ideally reduce emissions from the actual production. But if they can't, they're completely able to meet their obligations, if you like, under law by going out and buying carbon offsets. So that's findings elsewhere in the marketplace, these little bits of paper that say that somebody else, even if it's in another sector like planting trees rather than reducing emissions in the cement industry, they can buy those to say that somewhere in the economy, in the universe, those emissions have been reduced. Now, clearly, that's may or may not be very good for the climate, or the efficacy of that is highly questionable. The Chubb review into offsets earlier this year alleged that, well, found that there was nothing untoward about that there was like for like in terms of emission reductions in the atmosphere for buying carbon offsets rather than reducing emissions from source. But having knocked around, there's some big questions about things like just using tree offsets, because we have things like bushfires, pests, droughts. And so the efficacy of some of those offsets can be a bit questionable. And also they take a long time to grow and the emissions happen in this year. So needless to say, plenty of different groups have been advocating to strengthen what this safeguard mechanism can deliver. And so it is important, as I mentioned, it's 28% of the national greenhouse gas emissions. And it's probably time, I think, just to cut to the chase to say that today we actually did get, frankly, a really excellent, I mean, still more to go, but as far as I'm concerned, after being in this for 30, 35 years, a really good uptick in ambition and efficacy in terms of our climate laws. So I don't know, I'm just going to go to Tim. Why don't you tell us what happened today, what we got, and how wonderful it was to listen to Adam Bant and Chris Bowen and talk today about what they achieved.
Yeah, thank you. Like you, I am positive. I think today is a really important day. At the end of the day, it's not perfect. Let's put that clearly on the table. This is far from perfect, but we've been in reverse gear for a decade. We've been going in exactly the wrong direction. And now all of a sudden we have a government being pushed by the Greens and by the Teals to go harder. And they've got a mandate to act on the climate science, and the Teals and the Greens are pushing them to go a lot faster. So yeah, is Adam Bant totally happy? No. Is a lot in his party happy? Categorically not. But at the end of the day, he's pushed for greater ambition. And so I think today has seen a whole lot of extra improvements coming through, and that's enhancing a scheme that was acceptable, but it's nowhere near perfect. So I am happy. I'm relieved we got a whole lot of new enhancements. I think we have a lot more work to do, but at last we have a government that's actually collaborating and starting to act on the science. But I think it's important, exactly as Nick, you said, the safeguard mechanism, the elephant in the room is that most of the facilities are fossil fuel projects, and that's where Adam Bant and the Greens have been really sort of torn, and we've seen that very publicly by Bob Brown. At the end of the day, we know the science is clear, the IEA is clear, and the Greens are clear. We've got to stop Scope 3 emissions, oil, gas and coal exports from Australia. But the safeguard mechanism isn't about Scope 3 emissions, it's about Scope 1. So I'm far more of the view, momentum, not perfection. Let's get moving in the right direction, and let's continue to push for greater ambition and greater efforts going forward.
So just for those, the Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that come from directly burning your consumption of fossil fuels, for example. So in the case of coal or gas, could be the methane being flared out of a gas well or that kind of thing. So that's Scope 1 emissions, or actually could even be in your home when you turn on your cooker in the, when you go to make your dinner at night, you're burning that gas right there. That's Scope 1. Scope 2 is your electricity that you have in your house. Power station has burnt that coal. They're the ones accruing those emissions over on their bank books, but you're enjoying the electricity in your home for your lighting, perhaps, or your heating. That's Scope 2. So just, sorry, a little bit of a glossary there as Tim rollicks through the same. So let's talk, okay, so baselines was pretty exciting. Yes, Tim, when the proposal was on the table, we were actually going to, for the first time, have a proposal to reduce emissions 4.9% each year, every year, until 2030. That got through today, which is fantastic. But where did the Greens and the government come out on this concept of what the Greens were pushing in terms of no new coal and gas?
Yeah, I think they have actually won some pretty significant concessions there. So what they've said is that we have legislated that emissions, actually net emissions, not gross, but net emissions have to fall each and every year. So rather than having a targeted budget, which wasn't going to be legislated, we're now going to have a budget in emissions for this decade. We're going to have a target end result of 100 million tonnes emissions by 2030. So that's going to be part of the legislation. So it'll be a formal mandate. And so if the net combined action by all the participants is failing to deliver on that, then Chris Bowen's going to be forced to take harder action and more direct action. So that was clear. The Greens had made very clear that the legislation as it was initially proposed could still allow emissions to go up each and every year because of new entrants. So I think we've got some pretty major concessions. One is the budget for the total emissions to decline, and then for the end result. And then secondly, the other big concession, improvement, is that all new facilities, gas facilities that get approved by the federal government have to have net zero scope 1 emissions from day one. So Zali was talking about world's best practice was the mandate she was demanding for her amendment. We actually got better than that. They've got to go to zero from day one. Now, at the end of the day, I've sort of phrased that as the gas industry has been talking about carbon capture and storage for decades as this great white elephant. Sorry, did I say that? It's meant to be the great hope for their industry. Just touched mute by accident. They're now actually going to either have to deliver on carbon capture and storage and make it work, unlike what Chevron's demonstrated. And if not, they'll have to provide offsets. Now, I will maybe just go back. One comment you made, Nick, that I would challenge a little bit. I mean, I think the historic performance of the ACCUs has been woeful. But I think the Chubb review is all about improving the integrity of the system going forward. Now, a lot of environmentalists have pushed back and said, well, we haven't addressed all of the false credits that have been issued. But I think we have won some pretty serious improvements. I'm banking on the Chubb review to deliver improved integrity in the offsets market going forward. And at the end of the day, it's far from perfect, but we now have a price on carbon. It's going to go up over time. Finance gets the signal, and I think Tambourine Resources, the Beetaloo developer up in the Northern Territory, was saying, "Oh, it'll have no impact on us." Have a look at their share price today. I think there is a financial impact the market's assessing. That'll only get better over time as we close out all the other loopholes that still exist.
And Tim, the other thing I really enjoyed reading today was that there seems to be an uptick also in the supervisory aspect of this. So there's now a trigger where if what you talked about, that net position or individuals even are not meeting their reduction targets, or what's been not even a target, actually their obligations, there is a trigger whereby the minister can and should go in and have conversations to engage, understand what those issues are. And I don't know exactly where that goes. I haven't read the fine detail, but there's just never been this kind of supervisory aspect to it. The Climate Change Authority also has some sway in there as well. So I think from a disclosure and supervisory perspective, it's definitely an improvement. Did you want to talk, Tim, too? Also, I thought there's been a big pushback by some groups around those that are impacted, obviously, around the sort of idea of trade exposed. Like, if we're going to have these additional costs to Australian businesses and industries, isn't that going to make our exports uncompetitive? I noticed that there was an additional taxpayer sweetener that went out today to some of those big polluters. Let's not gloss it over. An extra $400 million, which feels like small biscuits when you talk about $368 billion worth of subs, but it's still a truckload of cash. So is there any real truth, or what's your sense around this concept about it, these Australian businesses and industries in terms of their international competitiveness, now that they've got to jump through these hoops and obviously spend more money to reduce emissions?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the big improvements that Adam Bant's teams negotiated is that none of that so the Powering of Regions Fund is a $600 million subsidy for big polluters, as you're saying. So Bowen's agreed to put in another $400 million of subsidies to big polluters to reduce their emissions. But the major improvement that the Greens have negotiated is that fossil fuel companies will not be able to get 1 cent of that $1 billion of taxpayer assistance. And there's also one which is rather unusual. Like when I first read, oh shit, this is a massive walking back of ambition. Here I am thinking we're ratcheting up, like we're meeting the Greens halfway, and instead we're actually walking it back. But there's a silver lining I'll come to. So not only has Chris Bowen thrown in an extra $400 million for heavily trade exposed industries, and he defines that cement, steel, aluminium, alumina. So it's industries that are real and of national strategic importance for Australia. Very explicitly excluded is any new oil, gas or coal, or any existing oil, gas or coal facility. So that trade assistance is only for the really trade exposed, the real players. At the end of the day, if we have a little extra tax on, or if methane production costs slightly more, their profit margin will go from 75% gross profit margin to 74%. Like, it's a drop in the ocean. It's immaterial to how much windfall loot that those guys are making. Whereas this is life or death for things like BlueScope. And at the end of the day, BlueScope's got to decide, are they going to build a new blast furnace down in Port Kembla? That's a $1 billion investment that they're proposing to go ahead with. Now, putting in an electric arc furnace with zero emissions, with scrap recycling, with hydrogen, with renewable energy power, that will cost a lot more. Now, what Chris Bowen has said is we, the taxpayer, will fund that. And he's also said that those industries, if they play ball, now what playing ball is yet to be defined, they will get a massive concession. They will be exempted from the 4.9% annual reduction. They'll only have to reduce their emissions by 1%. So, this is another big fillet there, but at the end of the day, only if they have a clear path to decarbonisation. Now, what that means in practice, the reality is we're talking about 6 or 7 facilities. That'll be Tomago Aluminium in Newcastle. It'll be Port Kembla Steelworks. It'll be the Whyalla Steelworks. It'll be the alumina refinery over in WA. It's literally some very significant industries. That's Rio, as usual, extracting some more taxpayer concessions. But at the end of the day, we want that value adding in Australia, and we need it. We need the jobs. We need the investment. We need the industry security. And the reality is, by lowering their ask, the budget's now been formally is going to be mandated in law. So if maybe 10% of the facilities only have to do 1% per annum, that means everyone else actually has to move faster than 4.9%. So that actually absorbs a lot of the excess fat that Bowen had stuck in. And I didn't think there was that much fat in it in the first place. So this means he's got even less wriggle room. And Nick, as you said, the Climate Change Authority and others will be watching like hawks. We'll be watching like hawks, and the ambition's got to go up over time. So yeah, I'm comfortable. We don't want to destroy our industry. And let's face it, this is in the context where America is throwing $800 billion of subsidies on the table. Japan's throwing $220 billion of subsidies. The EU is throwing hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies. They're all carrot, no stick. This is a big stick, and obviously they're throwing in some extra carrots, but we have to stay competitive. It is a global race, and unfortunately, it's not a free market anymore. It's a massively subsidized market in Japan, in Korea, in America, in China, and in Europe. So the idea that Australia is just going to leave it to the free market, it's not going to happen.
So last federal election is such a long time ago. How many times have been in the polling booth since then? I was really keen to have a look at the tax system, and obviously big questions around public funds going to subsidise fossil fuels. I think, if I might just paraphrase, Tim, you said that no new subsidies are going to fossil fuels. So, okay, so just because of time, let's just shake this out. It feels like, for me, it feels like a win in terms of climate wars. We got, I personally, in my day job, reached out to members of the Greens to offer a briefing on the safeguard mechanism, and every single one of them, except for the senator in charge of transition, said, not taking your briefing, Adam Bandt's the guy doing the negotiations. So great discipline and organisations from Greens, great support from the crossbench more broadly, including independents as well. We'll see what happens with the Senate. It looks like there's support from the Jackie Lambie party, including Tammy Terrell's part of that party, and obviously Senator Pocock, the Greens and ALP. What does it feel like an end of climate wars to you, Tim? I feel like there's so much more to get done. Do you have any closing parts around the content of what we saw today, what you hope to see next before we open up to questions?
Yeah, maybe there might be questions on methane, but I'll put that aside for now. To me, yes, we're actually seeing, as you said, a collaboration and a lifting in aspiration. I'll push back on one comment. The safeguard mechanism is only one of the many tools that the the Albanese government's putting on the table. Like, they've got the 82% renewables target. That is a hugely ambitious target. I was just talking to Arena. I mean, their budget has been expanded dramatically. The CFC's budget's been trebled. So we need to see a lot more firepower put in place, but there are a number of mechanisms that are underway. We're yet to see the full details of the EV policy and the emission standards on electric vehicles. We need to see a dramatic lifting in housing efficiency standards, neighbours ratings, that sort of stuff. So energy productivity. I think we'll see a whole raft of policies. This will prove to be one. It's a critical one, as you said, and it's great. It puts a price on carbon. I'm happy. Finance will see a price on carbon. And I spent a day last week, or a couple of days last week, talking to a whole lot of startups across Australia, and the amount of innovation and the amount of venture capital coming into this sector. There are a lot of new jobs and a lot of money can be unlocked, and a lot of smart people in Australia who have been waiting for proper ambition. So I think we'll see a very different conversation going forward than we've had for the last 10 years. So I'll also add, the global landscape has changed unbelievably since Biden got through his IRA, his Inflation Reduction Act. That is the biggest subsidy in world history, and it's changed the whole platform. We saw the Net Zero Industry Act from Europe 2 weeks ago. China, Japan, Korea, everyone's jumping on board. So it's great. We've actually got the technology race that the science demands we have. It's only a decade late, but it's coming.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, my dish about being the only stick was really about the pre-May 2022 election under the previous Liberal National Coalition government. That was their big kind of, jewel in the crown of laws, because we didn't get a CPRS, carbon pollution reduction scheme, we didn't get an emissions trading scheme, we didn't get a carbon tax, we got this safeguard mechanism, and now we've got it with a few tweaks and knobs. Has a while to go. Now, I wondered, is it time? Kerry, have you got any questions in the chat?
Yes, I do. So we have one question from Nick in the audience, which is a question that I've always wondered about. We have a hard cap, but does this still mean that facilities can buy their way out of their obligations using dodgy credits rather than actually trying to reduce their emissions? So
yeah, a little bit.
What
Tim,
about
you can
that?
have it.
Yeah, there was an interesting addition that Adam Band and his team negotiated, that if you can use unlimited offsets, that's still allowed. I think Bowen had made it very clear he wasn't going to give in on that one immediately. But he's put in a concession that you can only use up to 30%. If you go above 30%, you can still do it, but you've got to justify to the Climate Energy Regulator why you're not actually acting. Now, okay, moral suasion. At the end of the day, that'll be an interesting conversation. That's up to Bowen. So we've got to assume Chris Bowen's going to bring some integrity to this. And hopefully, as the climate science gets worse and worse, we know, as James's screen shows, we know the science is getting, the extreme weather events are only going to get worse and worse. So that'll just give the government more incentive to actually deliver what we really need. But yeah, anything above 30% now has to be evaluated. Any new entrant from the gas industry has to start with zero. So yeah, they're pretty important concessions. I'm pretty hopeful.
I've got a follow-up question there, Tim, from Nick O'Brien again, which is, can they use overseas credits or only the Australian
Yeah,
carbon
only
offsetting?
Australian ACCR, so Australian Carbon Credit Units or Safeguard Mechanism units can be used. So Bowen has said that they will do a review in 2025 for implementation in 2026. So that was part of the original proposal. Now it's conveniently after the next federal election. So hopefully then when Nick's already down in Canberra, ensconced as the extra teals, and then that will mean more ambition. So the Albanese government's trying to be the sensible centre for now, but we clearly, the science says we've got to go a lot harder. So there is no international linkage until that review. And I think what Chris Bowen's really saying is he really would like to link it in with the EU ETS. And I personally would be delighted, because the idea of a $75 cap on carbon emissions rising at inflation plus 2% per annum, that'll get you a carbon price of $100 Aussie by 2030. Whereas the EU ETS today is trading at 90 euros, which is 140, 150 Aussie dollars a tonne. So the only way the EU is going to allow Australia in is if the dodgy ACCUs are totally wiped from the system and that the Chubb review delivers integrity. Otherwise, there's no way the EU is going to allow Australia in. So we're not talking about crappy voluntary carbon credits. We're talking about actually best in class, and that is the EU. And I would love it if the EU accepted Australian ACCUs, because that means the integrity is real.
So Tim, leading up to this, I think Kerry's about to jump in on this one. We had an email from Gary White, who was asking about methane, because methane is something that has a shorter life, but is a hell of a lot more, has a higher global warming value. What's the word? Potential, GWP, potential, global warming potential, than carbon dioxide. So the question goes to whether it should be treated differently from carbon dioxide, and your views on the adequacy of measuring methane emissions from oil and gas facilities. Should they be considered differently under this package of solutions?
Yeah, I've had a rapid learning curve in the last 3 weeks on global warming potential of methane. Yes, and I will put very clearly, I am a finance analyst, not a carbon analyst, but I've been working with Professor Ian Lowe, and he's put out a major report highlighting the real shortcomings in the safeguard mechanism, which we publish. So if you go to my website, you can find his report or go to Lock the Gate. But anyway, Professor Ian Lowe has put out a report highlighting that if you actually measure methane properly, in other words, on a 20-year life cycle, GWP 20, not GWP 100, then methane in the safeguard mechanism is about 70% of all the emissions covered in the safeguard mechanism. So methane's the absolute elephant in the room. Now, as to your question, Nick, he's also highlighted a second issue, which is that the massive underreporting of methane, the lack of credible, I mean, there is no measuring, there is no verification, there is no monitoring, there is no public reporting on methane. It's all a single desktop study, which has been funded by the gas industry. It's been bastardized, might be the right word, by the gas industry. And so the IEA, the International Energy Agency, came out a month ago and just called out Australia and most methane producers, like methane gas, LNG, as underreporting their methane emissions. The IEA said Australia is underreporting by about 60%. So when you put two different factors in, one is the 60% underreporting of our methane, and secondly, when you actually deal with the climate emergency, like we need to deal with it this decade and next decade, not next century. So unfortunately, the scientists are way too conservative. They talk about everything on a 100-year view. It's interesting, the one thing I agree with Woodside, I'll wash my mouth out afterwards, but Woodside actually says they use in all their internal reporting, all of their external reporting, they use a global warming potential of 20 years. And so methane is very different to carbon dioxide. And at the end of the day, the idea that you're going to trade a carbon dioxide emission credit for a methane credit is, it's just wrong, because the science is dead right. We have a climate emergency. We've got to act on the next 10, 20 years. So we need to think about methane as 84 times worse than carbon dioxide, not the 100-year view, which says it's only 25 times worse.
There's a question here from
If I can just jump in there, Nicolette. So there's a question come direct into me as the host. So from Rod, could we see a boom in small, dirty startups in the steel, aluminium and cement industries, which would be outside the mechanism? And then we'll take Thor's question as the final one. So could we see a boom in small, dirty startups?
I would say categorically no. Finance is not stupid. They know globally momentum is accelerating. They know technology is moving. Economies of scale work against that anyway. But at the end of the day, one of the big challenges was, why is the safeguard mechanism only limited to 100,000 tonnes? Surely we should do it at 25,000 tonnes. But there's a review in 2.5 years' time. They will reduce that to 25,000 because we've got to actually do it across the whole economy. We can't just regulate 215 facilities. We've got to have the whole economy working. So finance is not stupid. Within 2.5 years, we're going to have a 25,000 tonne cap, would be my hope. And so this is just the first move. It's nowhere near perfect. I did say that. I'll say it again. It's nowhere near perfect. And I know that a lot of environmentalists are really, really unhappy with the safeguard mechanism. It's been compromised, but at the end of the day, using anything that Tony Abbott created has to be flawed. But I think it's been enhanced significantly since then, and we will continue to enhance it over time. We have to, because the science is dead clear.
And I think, Tim, that goes nicely into Thor's question, which was, if the safeguard mechanism was initially created by the LNP, why are they against it now? Do they actually have a concrete objection, or is it just no for political no's sake?
Anyone a member of the LNP who can actually answer that one? I'm not.
They've just made themselves irrelevant. Now, we saw that in the state election. They're just and they're just going further to the right and becoming more and more irrelevant. So but the trouble with that, and I mean, I'm not just blowing this smoke up, Nick. We need the Teals, we need the Greens, we need to have a credible opposition voice. Parliament does not work if you've got an all red country. We need to have a credible opposition, and the LNP is asleep at the wheel. They're not an opposition, so they've left it to Adam Bandt, they've left it to the Teals. Thankfully, the Teals and Adam and David Pocock are up for the challenge, and they've pushed Bowen for more aggression. So while Dutton's in charge, they'll probably stay asleep at the wheel. In the meantime, we can get some climate action.
I saw that this week when Sophie Scoggs, today's Monday, was the one in Question Time who asked about the UNFCCC's, the IPCC's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recent assessment report. This is the job of the opposition, to ask whether a government receives the recommendations and how they're going to respond to something like that. Not a pimp out of the middle. It had to come from the crossbench, from the member of Mackellar. So yes, that I concur. Are you going to keep asking the questions, Kerry? You do such a good job there.
Well, I think the final question, as we're hurtling towards our 8:05, 8:10 finish, is from Caroline and Stuart. Is green hydrogen a reality as part of the solution? Will it receive some of the government funding?
Tim and I have views on this, don't we? I'm gonna start. I think it does have some role to play, but in a very limited part of our economy, I think. I think we have such an abundance of solar and wind and other natural renewable energy resources that we can directly make that electricity and put that electricity into the goods and services that we make here, and that we and minerals that we can process before we export. That's our mojo. That's how we are going to be a clean energy superpower. The green hydrogen part does play a role in some potential industrial processes. However, it's a little bit like growing cows who have to, you have to kind of have your fodder, you grow your grass and water and fertilizers and sun and everything else, and then your cow eats that, and then you eat a piece of the cow. The prolific value of that is not particularly sensible to the human species. You just want to eat the grass yourself. I'm being really quite, not intentionally flippant, but this is what happens with some of the proposals around green hydrogen. It itself is a high-end, high-quality fuel that takes a lot of renewable energy to get it green. So I think it will have limited application. My personal view, I work at the Smart Energy Council a few days a week. They're very very gung-ho about the possibilities of green hydrogen. I wonder, Tim, you can weigh in on this one now.
Yeah, Australia, like 2 years ago, we had more green hydrogen press releases announced than any other country in the world. And like they were the biggest, and we're talking $50 billion projects. And you might have heard of the Australian Renewable Energy Hub. It used to be called the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. I mean, it's a $50 billion investment proposal, 26 gigawatts. You might have seen BP bought into it about 6 months ago. They bought 40% of it. Macquarie is a big shareholder. So anyway, it's the biggest green hydrogen proposal in the world, yet it's actually not moved at all in the space of 5 or 6 years, because we're still 5 or 10 years away from green hydrogen being commercially viable. Now, it will dramatically change over the next 5 years, because the American government's just thrown a massive, like $100 billion subsidy towards the deployment of green hydrogen at scale. They $3 a kilogram subsidy for every ton of green hydrogen anyone makes in America for the next 10 years. Now, that will get a lot of the learning by doing through. And at the moment, Australia has literally one operating green hydrogen facility. It's a pilot, or maybe 1 or 2 electrolyzers, 1 or 2 megawatts, but we need to do this at gigawatt scale to make any difference. But it's worth bearing in mind, Australia is a huge importer of ammonia. So we import ammonia, fossil ammonia, from Canada massively. So Twiggy's proposing to replace imported ammonia with domestic green ammonia on Gibson Island in Brisbane. Wesfarmers is one of the biggest importers of ammonia over in Western Australia. They're proposing to build another fossil ammonia facility to double the size of it. Now, maybe the safeguard mechanism's enough to make Michael Chaney wake up and actually accept the climate science. I doubt it. He'll need to retire. But at the end of the day, Wesfarmers, one of our most successful companies, and yet they're still building new fossil ammonia projects. In this day and age, it's stupid. We need to import, replace. We need to learn by doing. And as Nick says, it's probably going to be challenged. It's like there is no green ammonia ship, and there won't be for a decade. So the idea of Australia exporting green ammonia, it won't happen. And the idea of us even exporting green hydrogen. Yeah, you can export ammonia today, green ammonia, or we import fossil ammonia, but you need a price on carbon. So green ammonia could work into Japan, Korea, but they need to have a price on carbon. So it's great news that the Japanese government has just proposed a phased-in national emissions trading scheme starting 2026. Without a price on carbon, green ammonia is not going to have any validity for Australia.
Kerry, have we got any time left?
So we are hurtling. Chris has snuck in with a question about the finance industry, which will probably have to be our last one. So in that classic moderator style, your closing remarks guided by Chris's question, which is, what pressure will the finance industry introduce to help bring fast bipartisan action on climate change?
Whoa, that's another topic. Can we pick that? You know what? I'd love to do a session, 40 minutes on that, maybe in a week or two's time. That's a really good one. Tim, do you want to? I don't have enough time to answer that one. I don't even know if it's pressure. They're just going to make good, sensible decisions, aren't they? Because they've got a fiduciary duty to their customers from this point forward to manage risk. Tim?
They have to manage risk, but they're really challenged at the moment. I mean, the point you make about risk, they have the sole purpose test. So all private pension capital has to manage sole purpose tests. Now, at the end of the day, that's where leaving it to the free market's not going to work. So I talk to a lot of people in private finance. They are really keen to move, but the sole purpose test is at the moment a real obstacle, as is the MySuper legislation that benchmarks them every year on their risk returns. So you stray from your index, you can lose your license and be closed down by APRA. So at the end of the day, we need some reform. We also need the government to lead. And at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer in the power of free markets, but there is no free market in the energy transition. You've got the biggest subsidy in world history in America. You've got the Europeans responding. You've got the Japanese and Koreans doing what they always do, responding. China is a state economy. They're the world's leader in all of this. So the idea that Australia is just going to leave it to the market, not going to happen. We will miss out. So we at the Smart Energy Council as well are working to push for the federal government to crowd in private capital to make sure we have enough money on the table, national interest public capital to crowd in the huge $3.4 trillion super pool in Australia. It's a huge resource. We just need the right legislative framework, and the safeguard mechanism is a key tool in that, hence why I'm positive.
Thanks, Tim. I'm off to Canberra tomorrow to do some advocacy work on household electrification. This is a really exciting area, anti-inflationary as well. There's 440,000 homes, public and community homes across Australia, housing around 800,000 people. They live in these homes that are 1.7 stars worth of energy, very leaky, uncomfortable, unhealthy gas, cooking, all those types of things in there. Cost the bomb to run these things. This is one of those fantastic opportunities to just have win-win-win all round. It's another example, Tim, where the markets are not going to help on that one. That's just the job of the government to step in, leverage some private capital if possible, but just get that job done. It's the right thing to do, and it lifts the entire industry and the economy more broadly. So I'm excited about going to Canberra tomorrow. If anyone wants a lift down in my Tesla, I'm leaving at 9 o'clock. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Kerry, over to you.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank both of you, Nicolette and Tim, for having the intellect and the generosity of spirit to be able to explain it to us in simple terms, because I'm also impressed by the fact we have experts living and working among us and we can explain it, which is amazing. I'd also like to thank the audience for their very intelligent questions and helping us think our way through. I can see that this type of listen and learn short, sharp seminar might become something that we take forward going forward. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for Nicolette and Tim, and enjoy the rest of your night. And in due course, this will pop up on Nicolette's YouTube once I've worked out how to do that.
Oh, maybe I should have mentioned the Tesla to Canberra then. Whoop, too late, did it again. Okay.
Okay, goodbye all.